Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, today saw a recovery in emerging market stocks after a shock sell-off earlier this week. Investors, of course, are still digesting China's clampdown on the technology sector and, of course, the spread of the COVID-19 Delta strain. Now, MSCI's index of emerging market equities jumped 1% on the day, on course to make back last week's losses, as, of course, Chinese and Hong Kong shares gained today. In South Africa, the all share was able to break a three-day losing streak as Naspers, which owns 29% of Chinese internet giant Tencent via its global investment vehicle process, firmed up for the day for the first time in 3 sessions. Now, also coming up on today's show. SADC's economic growth rate dips by 4.8% in 2020. Germany luxury car brand BMW hits better than expected second quarter profits of $5.7 billion. And this eco-friendly startup is shaking things up in Ghana's auto sector. Now, the Southern African Development Community's economic growth rate contracted by 4.8% in 2020. That is according to a report released by the Regional Group's Secretariat, which is based in Botswana. Here's CGTN's Angelo Coppola with the details.
Regional annual inflation increased to an average of 49.6% in 2020 from 16.4% in 2019, largely due to heightened inflationary pressures in Zimbabwe. The region's current account balance widened from an average deficit of 4.2% in 2019 to 4.7% in 2020.
The COVID pandemic has hit the region hard, and we were coming from a slowdown previously in terms of growth. If you look at the figures from 2011, 2012, the growth has been slowing down.
Economic prospects for the bloc remain pessimistic, as the region still depends on the natural resources, agriculture and mining sectors for growth.
You are looking at the domestic scenario whereby production is still being impacted by the COVID itself. Because of these measures, you have to limit the production. But on the demand side, you are also faced with the challenge of the supply chains being broken. And that will drag on for the next 2-3 years. Who knows?
While the medium-term view remains pessimistic, there are opportunities. But some work first needs to be done on in-country industrial development to exploit external opportunities.
Do we have the product to sell to this market? That's why I'm saying that I'm pessimistic, because the approach which is necessary to address the current scenario in the medium, even to the long term, sustainably, it depends on addressing the structures of our economies by developing the industrial sector through value chain development.
SADC has all the plans in place. It now needs to implement them in order to grow economically. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
And heading to Nigeria now, the country will be looking to take advantage of a fund allocated by the International Monetary Fund to boost its struggling economy. Now, the IMF has set aside an estimated $3.35 billion to help Nigeria recover from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our correspondent, Philly, has a report from Abuja.
The fund, called Special Drawing Rights or SDRs, is drawn from the IMF's reserve to make emergency loans available so that developing nations like Nigeria can shore up their currency reserves without the need to borrow at high interest rates. According to IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, the entire SDR approved for all countries is worth an equivalent of $650 billion and is the largest ever allocation from the IMF's reserves. She says the historic decision was born out of the desire by the IMF to assist global economies at a time of unprecedented crisis. The aim is to boost global liquidity at a time when the world is struggling with the coronavirus pandemic. Africa's largest economy bounced back from a recession in February as a result of the easing of pandemic restrictions. Since then, the government has been intensifying efforts to diversify its crude oil-dependent economy to revamp other sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, health, and transportation. According to the IMF, the general allocation of SDRs will become effective on August 23. Phil Ihaza, CGTN, Abuja.
Well, let's move on now. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic last year, African entrepreneurs continue to innovate and attract record levels of venture capital investments. Now, a new report by the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association revealed that the volumes of total reported venture capital deals in Africa in 2020 rose to 319 from just 140 the year before. Now, startups were the stars, raising over $1 billion. AVCA says they're changing the continent's economic landscape and also creating new market opportunities. Now, also, financials remain the most attractive sector for VC investment, followed closely by information technology. But most importantly, technology is clearly driving that growth. 90% of all reported VC deals between 2014 and 2020 were in technology-enabled firms who are operating across a variety of sectors. Well, let's now delve further into that report. We're joined by Abi Mustafa Madwakor. She is the CEO of African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Great to have you with us today. Now, it certainly appears that the pandemic and a challenging year for private investment globally, that has had no visible negative impact on VC activity in Africa. In fact, we're seeing the volumes of deals increasing. Give us a sense, what were some of the key findings in that report? What has it revealed about the importance of startups to Africa's growth story going forward?
Great. Firstly, hello, Uche. Thank you for having me. Yes, indeed, the past 2 years have been quite successful for VC in Africa, particularly in 2020, as you mentioned. In terms of the volume of deals, there were 319 deals, which is 3 times the typical year-on-year average we've had over the past 6 years, really demonstrating the buoyancy and the increased interest in the sector. You also touched on the actual value of capital that was deployed to VC deals in 2020 being 1.1 billion. And this was just marginally lower than what was deployed in 2019. And the reason for this, as you can see, the volume of deals have increased, but the value has slightly decreased. And that's because we're seeing more activity in the seed stage investment, so the early stage investment, which was more than we had seen in previous years. So these deals, looking across the last 6 years, account for 30% of the deals that we've had in the 6-year period. If we look a little bit, just to focus on more headlines on where the regions where we're seeing this capital directed, South Africa is attracting the lion's share of VC deals, followed by Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya. And it's worth noting how Egypt is increasingly becoming an investment destination for VC activity. And this is echoed by, we did an industry survey that we do annually, where we just survey the sentiment of a selection of limited partners and general partners. And they also ranked Egypt as a destination of interest for their investment over the next 3 years. So we are watching that space, and it's very exciting to see kind of VC activity just blossoming in that region. And I guess the final headline that I would like to highlight is really the diversity of where we're seeing deal activity. And I touch on this a lot, and I think it's quite important. We saw 11% of the VC investments that were invested in startups with a female CEO. Likewise, 31% of the investments went to startups that were founded by a female or had at least one female founder. Yes, it might not, it might be a dip in the ocean, but it's certainly a step in the right direction, and certainly moves us closer to achieving gender parity in this space. But to answer your question about kind of what's the importance of startup in Africa in general, it can't be overstated, the importance of this community in Africa. We're an extremely enterprising continent, and startups have really, especially around COVID, started to innovate in critical spheres of the economy and just creating new ways and innovative ways to really address some of the long-standing challenges that we've had. And the beauty of this community is that they have the ability to scale, thereby creating jobs and bridging the unemployment gap that has plagued the continent for quite some time. And we've seen that ability to scale in the likes of Flutterwave, Chippercash, and those other businesses that have raised later stage funding. And my final point around startups is what is really interesting, what we're starting to see is that startups themselves that have raised VC funding are starting to pay the cycle forward. So we recently saw Flutterwave invest in a Nigerian fintech earlier this year, and we also saw MFS Africa, a VC-backed company, invest in a Ugandan fintech startup this year. So it's an interesting movement. We're seeing entrepreneurs financing entrepreneurs, which is changing the economic landscape by really growing the available of domestic pool of capital that's available to invest in startups.
Right. And speaking of fintechs, 90% of all reported VC deals between 2014 and 2020, they were in tech-enabled companies across a variety of sectors, not just fintech. Looking at your findings, explain to us how we're seeing innovation and technology sort of driving economic growth and those VC deals right now.
Yeah, so Uche, innovation has been critical over the last 18 months for reasons that are quite obvious. I mean, globally, we've gone through periods of restricted mobility. Some African countries are still going through that. We've had disruptions in global supply chains and simply globally, and the continent is no exception, we've really had to rethink how we do business and how we solve challenges. And technology has played a really critical role in just reframing our thinking on the continent and allowing entrepreneurs, as I said earlier, to create solutions that have disrupted traditional sectors. And unsurprisingly, as we all know, the adoption of technology in the financial sector has been the most prevalent, which is why fintech deals, financials account for the largest share of our tech and technology-enabled deals. And we've seen a lot of those raises, and I mentioned two of them earlier. But more broadly, the adoption of tech-enabled solution has been transformative across a variety of sectors, essentially bringing efficiency, reducing fragmentation in these sectors. And I'll just touch on a couple of these sectors. We've seen technology being used to address Africa's wide infrastructure deficit. As we all know, the public sector can't close that gap on its own, and the private sector is critical here. So we've seen a number of technological solutions being applied to close this gap with some interesting companies, doing some interesting things in digital solutions to access to electricity. Looking at the healthcare sector, as we saw, COVID-19 really exposed the fragility of Africa's health systems. And we've seen a number of businesses that operate across the wide gamut of the value chain in the healthcare space use technology as a key enabler to address some of the challenges. Businesses such as Elara Health, which is a health tech powered diagnostic provider in Kenya. And if we look at the agriculture sector, technology is just changing the dynamics of this sector completely through the use of modernized farming technology, temperature, moisture sensors, drone, artificial intelligence, all of which to enhance farming productivity. And there we're seeing startups like Farm Crowdy in Nigeria and Kenya's M-Farm. And these startups, as well as some others, are really demonstrating the power of digitization in the agriculture sector. And I think that's really interesting, particularly because that sector has, historically done things in a bit of an archaic way. So it's really good to see the adoption of technology in that sector. And finally, in the transportation, logistics, and generally in the mobility sector, we're seeing a lot of innovation being applied there in companies like Heat Riding app, on the logistics side with Kobo 360, and also with Trello, the digital trucking marketplace in Egypt. So I definitely think it's trending positive. What's really good is that technology is almost becoming an enabler for a multitude of sectors. And I really think that trend is going to continue in 2021 and beyond.
Well, definitely a lot of encouraging trends there. But on that note, what are your findings in terms of who is investing and how much they're investing? And certainly, what does this all bode for Africa's private equity landscape this year and going forward?
So the good thing we're seeing is the wide breadth and diversity of investors in VC deals in 2020. And that's a similar theme to what we saw in 2019 as well. And when I talk about the diversity, I mean in the type of investor and the geography of the investors. So if we look at just the type of investors initially, we're seeing 40% of the investment in VC deals were by private equity and venture capital fund managers. So what's interesting is we've seen a lot of private equity fund managers investing in VC deals. So we saw the investment in Tunes, for instance, we saw by Helios, and we saw TPG Growth investment in Grow Intelligence. So that's interesting. And those fund managers coupled with VC fund managers account for about 40% of the VC deals. Then we move on to another interesting kind of cohort of investors, the corporate ventures, who account for about 10% of the VC deals that we saw in 2020. And these are the likes of, we're seeing Visa, Stripe, Google, Toyota Ventures. And our prediction is that we're going to see more of these corporate ventures coming to invest in Africa. And then we have other investors such as the accelerators, the incubators, family offices, angels, HNIs and foundations. And again, we're probably going to see more of these investors occupying spaces in VC deals. So if we look at where the capital is flowing from, almost 80% of the capital that went into the VC deals during the period were from international investors. Of that, 40% of them were North American investors, and that's not surprising given Silicon Valley players being excited about Africa and wanting to play in this space. What we're hoping to see is more domestic capital going into African VC. And like I touched on earlier, the fact that we're seeing entrepreneurs investing in entrepreneurs is really positive, and we're hoping to see the split between African vis-a-vis international investors, that ratio increase a little bit. And then in terms of kind of the value of these deals, what's interesting is that this year, less than 20% of the deals, of the investments were in deals 50 million and below, which is in contrast with last year, where about 50% of the deals were in 50 million and above. So what this is telling us is there's more activity, as I mentioned earlier, in this seed and early stage investing phase. And from what we've seen in 2021, this trend is likely to continue.
Well, we do have to leave it there, but many thanks for those great insights and that update on the report. That, of course, was Abi Mustafa Madwakor. She was the CEO of African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. And on that note, let's take a look at some corporate headlines today. Rwanda Air and Qatar Airways have signed an interline agreement as part of a strategic partnership. The deal will give travelers more access to over 160 destinations in the combined network from the carriers' respective Kigali and Doha hubs. Now, this comes amid plans by Qatar Airways to take a 49% stake in Rwanda Air. And Toyota Motor Corporation has posted a record quarterly operating profit of $8.2 billion for the first quarter, underlining resilience amid the coronavirus pandemic and, of course, global chip shortages. Now, operating profit at the firm rose to $9.15 billion for the 3 months ending June 30th, well above the $127 million earned in the pandemic-hit first quarter a year earlier. And the chief executive of Kenya Power has resigned effective immediately in shock changes at the loss-making power utility. Now, Bernard Ngugi quit barely 2 years after he was appointed as a CEO. This comes amid pressure from shareholders of the firm, the government, and trade unions over turnaround plans to stop a streak of losses at the utility. And finally, Nigeria's telecom industry has attracted foreign direct investment worth over $450 million in 2020. That's down from over $940 million in 2019. Now, this represents a 55.7% decrease in the worth of investments attracted by the sector, largely due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Well, we're heading into a short break now. Do stay with us. We'll be right back.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay, we'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Uche Okoronkwo. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how whole stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back. Well, let's go to Egypt now, where President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is planning to hike the price of subsidized bread in his country. He says that the increase will help his government cover the cost of meals provided to school children. This is, of course, the latest move in a series of austerity measures taken by his government to overhaul its economy. The president did not give details on the amount or timing of that looming hike. The Egyptian leader spoke during the opening of a mega food industries complex in the Nile Delta province of Menufia, which will provide school meals for around 13 million children across the country.
The time has come for the price of bread, a loaf of 5 piastres, to increase. Someone might tell me that I should have asked the government or Prime Minister, Dr. Mustafa, or the Supply Minister to make the decision. But no, I will take responsibility for changing the situation in front of my country and my people. It is unbelievable that we provide 20 loaves of bread for the same price of just 1 cigarette. I'm saying this live on television to all Egyptians. This has to stop. We need 8 billion Egyptian pounds to supply meals to our students, and we don't have the money. The issue needs to be reorganized in a suitable way. I'm not saying we make it significantly more expensive, as it costs the government 65 or 60 piastres, but this has to stop.
Well, let's now get the latest on this news. Adel Mahoui joins us now in Cairo. Now, always good to see you on the show, Adel. As we know, bread prices are a pretty sensitive issue for Egyptians. History shows that previous attempts by other leaders have pretty much backfired. Let's start then with the reaction we're seeing from citizens and, of course, analysts in the country to the President Sisi's declaration today.
Uche, this is definitely surprising news to all Egyptians, and that's primarily because in 2016, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, in one of his televised speeches, he said that the prices of the bread have not changed and will not change, and that was a promise back in 2016. Of course, the entire economic situation and circumstances are totally different, specifically given the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the country. The news have been quite surprising and shocking, especially to most Egyptians who live under poverty line and live in the rural, where economic situations are quite dire. Bread in Egypt is quite essential. The word Egyptians use for bread in Arabic is aish, which translates in Arabic to living. And this is basically the phrase that they use. It's the most favorite and popular source of carbohydrates. It's part of almost every meal for Egyptians, and about 70 million people enjoy the benefits of the bread subsidies that the government extends to the public through smart cards that regulates this whole process. So definitely this is a very sensitive issue. It will not be taken easily. It will not go away. It will have its impact on families, especially poor families who enjoy the subsidies. And history basically showed that in about 77, there were blood and violent riots against President al-Sadat when he attempted to increase the bread prices. In early 80s, protests broke against President Mubarak in that regard. But of course, the political situation is entirely different. But since 1988, the bread price have been fixed at 5 piastres and has not changed since, which is also a lot of time.
Well, let's take a closer look at that subsidy. According to the president's words, and as you just mentioned, the loaf currently sells for around 5 piastres. Now, the president said it costs about 60 to 65 piastres to make that loaf. As Egypt's IMF loan program and, of course, President Sisi's government is looking to rein in subsidy programs in the country, how much then is this bread subsidy costing the government?
Well, basically, the subsidies paid on the bread alone is about 3.6 billion US dollars, which is, of course, a lot of money and a huge burden to a government that is fighting to decrease its deficit and try to maintain proper health care and revamp the education sector, along with other public facilities that and services that the government offers. So for the budget, definitely it is a strain. The prices are roughly, yes, Egyptians buy the bread at 5 piastres. That's, to put it in US dollars, that's 0.0003 cents, which is, of course, so little. And at the same time, it costs the government about tenfold. And it's a big challenge. So now it depends on how the government will proceed next. But in overall, will the government be able to proceed with that plan without facing any riots or any public unrest? It's mostly likely, because of the current circumstances and the political situations are totally different than before. So how the government will proceed, this will definitely dictate what will happen next.
Right. And of course, urban consumer inflation, that accelerated to 4.9% in June. It is expected to climb even further due to fuel and power price hikes, also relating to subsidies. What impact then will a hike in bread prices have on Egyptians' pockets right now? Can you estimate that?
So on Egyptians that enjoy the subsidies from the government, we're talking about families at the poverty line or even below it. And these are families that barely make the minimum wage or even less. So we're talking about from $100 to $200 monthly per household. And of course, there is a huge gap within even that range. So for them, if the bread prices, for example, goes up by another 5 piastres, which is 100% increase in the prices, and to the government, there is still 11 folds that it's been paying since in terms of subsidies. That will translate in about Egyptians having to cover the separation or the difference in their bread income. They will have to buy it, and that can go up to like $5, $6, $7 depending on the family size a month. In dollars, they seem a little, but for a family that has an income of $100, it is of course a burden to them.
Now, right now, this whole bread price increase, it certainly seems to be a maybe, not a sure thing. The supply ministry says it's now studying raising those bread prices. But what sense do you get, Adele, about how soon we can expect to see any solid movement on that issue, given how sensitive, of course, it is?
If the president is announcing it, it means it's coming, and it will not take a lot of time, because the government definitely has been thinking about the issue. The president will not be going to speak about it without having a plan about the timing and a figure about how much the bread prices will spike or will increase. But when, of course, there isn't any indication, because as I told you earlier, no one expected that the government will come near the bread prices. And therefore, the entire announcement and how the government will approach that will be surprising, definitely. But in terms of announcement, when the president speaks about it, it's sort of a preparation for the public to get ready that this is happening and it is coming soon. Again, Uche, it is very crucial to highlight that how much the government will increase the prices of the bread will definitely have an impact. A 5 piastres increase, as I told you, is about $4 to $5 depending on the family size. 10 piastres, even if it goes to 25 piastres, that's we're doubling these figures to reach maybe about 5 to 10% of a family living under the poverty line, its income, that will go on these additional payment for the bread itself. And therefore, it is quite sensitive, and people now really want to know what will happen and how much will they pay for bread.
All right. Well, we're certainly holding out to hear more on that. Many thanks, Adele, for that update. That, of course, was Adele El Maroui joining us there in Cairo. Now, stakeholders in South Sudan are working to improve access to people in need of humanitarian assistance and security. This is particularly important in areas where communal violence and a lack of infrastructure has left many people vulnerable. Here's CGTN's Daniela Pearson bringing us those details.
Stakeholders have been meeting in Juba to discuss security matters affecting the country. Involved in the deliberations are government officials, security forces, and the UN mission in South Sudan.
Even if we encounter differences of approach and points of difference in the past, working together with respect for each other's responsibilities will make us stronger.
This workshop is very central for trust building and for us to be able to open a new page in how to coordinate our activities between various institutions of security of our country and the United Nations mission in South Sudan.
Authorities have raised concerns over challenges faced by peacekeepers and humanitarian agencies during missions. Their work involves reaching people that need protection, food, and medical supplies, among other urgent assistance. Officials say that a common effort to streamline security is needed.
It could only be possible because of very close interactions, regular visits all around, by building mutual trust, by sharing the information at every level, leaders and staff, and solving any challenges amicably through discussion and dialogue.
We are, as a force, much more mobile than we've ever been. Our patrols are going out all over the country to protect civilians wherever they may be threatened. And the level of threat has spread throughout the country, and it's necessary for us to have that access.
A need for quick action was prompted after thousands of people fled their homes following armed attacks in the western Equatoria region. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a short break now, but still to come. German luxury car brand BMW hits a better than expected second quarter profit of $5.7 billion. And China's largest video game company vows to reduce children's access to online games.
Taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time, it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Over the last 14 hours of rain.
No one again he can hold in guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
The Excellency, thank you very much for your time now. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Welcome back. Now, German luxury car brand BMW posted a better than expected second quarter profit of $5.7 billion, and that's compared with a loss in the same period a year ago. The company, however, says global semiconductor chip shortages and higher raw material prices may hurt its performance in the second half of the year. Here's Ryan Thompson with more from Frankfurt.
BMW says 2021 profits will be even higher than expected following a strong second quarter result that was released on Tuesday. The German automaker took in a profit of $5.7 billion, much of that boosted by strong sales and a competitive price market. At this point last year, the company was struggling, desperately looking to make up for a $250 million loss, which was caused by COVID-19. But the pandemic has had some positive effects in the long run, notably a near historic demand in car buying. BMW's results follow other German rivals, Volkswagen and Daimler, who both posted big profits for the first half of the year. All three of these automakers are warning, though, that the global chip shortage will dent results, especially in the next few months when these brands will really start to feel a supply crunch. BMW executives say they expect a resolution to the chip shortage by the end of the year, but they've also been less affected compared to some other European automakers. And in a note to investors, BMW reaffirmed that it is focused on the electrification of its entire brand and will meet European Commission goals for 2035, which would ban fossil fuel cars. So far, 2 new electric models are planned for debut before the end of the year. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Frankfurt.
Now, China's largest video game company, Tencent, has vowed to reduce children's access to online games. Shares of the tech giant plunged after a state media article described the games as, in quotes, spiritual opium and electronic drugs. It urged greater protection of young people. Here's CGTN's Ann Chang reporting from Hong Kong.
Local blue chips declined on Tuesday after a publication run by Xinhua News Agency criticized online gaming addiction as spiritual opium and called for curbs. Now, the Economic Information Daily had quoted a student who said his schoolmates played 8 hours a day of Honor of Kings, which is one of Tencent's most popular games. The link to the online post was removed a couple of hours later and then restored later in the day without the opium reference and with some re-edited parts. But this has heightened concerns of Beijing's tighter regulation on online gaming. So shares in Tencent, which runs the world's largest video gaming business by revenue, plummeted over 10% during early trading and losing almost $60 billion from its market capitalization. And after the online article was removed, Tencent recovered some lost ground and closed 6% lower. Meanwhile, the Hang Seng Index opened in the red, dropping as much as 461 points before reversing course as Tencent recouped and finished the day down 0.2% at 26,194. Now, other firms linked to the video game industry also weren't spared. NetEase dropped about 15% before settling at about 8% lower, while CMG Technology plummeted almost 14%. This renewed volatility comes after China's tech stocks had their worst month since the global financial crisis in July, following a regulatory campaign against tech sectors that include education, ride-hailing, and social media. And in response, Tencent has pledged to limit playtime for minors to just an hour during weekdays and 2 hours on holidays. It also plans to ban in-game purchases for those under 12 years old and called for the consideration of a complete ban for that age group. Ann Chang, CGTN, Hong Kong.
And now we look at the impact of recent COVID infections on China's tourism sector. The Civil Aviation Administration has issued a notice to airliners so that tourists are able to cancel flight tickets. As a result, travel platforms are now experiencing a surge in refund requests.
Ms. Han and her family has planned to travel. They have booked a round-trip ticket from Beijing and Lanzhou more than a month in advance. But now, due to concerns over the pandemic, Ms. Han has decided to cancel all travel plans.
My husband does not agree that we should travel to other cities now, so we have to cancel all of our tickets.
In light of the renewed outbreak in COVID-19 cases, China's Aviation Authority has issued a new notice to the industry. Passengers who purchased domestic air tickets for August will be able to get refunds free of charge. Since this notice was issued, travel platforms have seen a surge in refund orders.
Compared to the Euro situation in the last few days, early cancellations have increased by 10-fold since 8 a.m. this morning.
In fact, the number of inquiries to cancel travel orders has been rising sharply since mid-July. Meanwhile, the government is also taking measures to curb the spread of the pandemic. To date, Nanjing has closed its tourist districts. Yangzhou has stopped public transport, as well as taxi and car-hailing services in the main city areas. In Zhengzhou and Xi'an, classic scenic spots have shut down.
And new rules have come into effect in China that aim to ease some of the privacy fears over facial recognition technology. Now, China's Supreme People's Court has specified a set of regulations it says will better protect the data of citizens. The measures follow rising concerns over infringements amongst consumers. Here's CGTN Sun Ye reporting from China.
Cameras are being reined in across China under a judicial interpretation on the use of facial recognition by China's top court. Starting this month, collecting, using, storing, processing, or transferring facial scans now all require explicit permission from the user. Doing otherwise will be deemed an infringement of their personal rights.
The rules have come as many cell phone applications now ask for our faces when firing up. Payments are often made through facial swipe, and as some neighborhoods have come to use facial recognition for entry, the technology that has made life increasingly convenient is also increasingly a source of concern.
Guo, being a law scholar and the person to file the country's very first lawsuit against the application of facial recognition technology, says the interpretation of the top court couldn't have come soon enough.
This interpretation is very timely, as it deals with one of the most high-risk areas of personal right protection. I think it will effectively curb the abuse of the technology and act as a guide on how to legally and compliantly use people's facial and other personal data.
Guo filed his lawsuit against a zoo in Hangzhou that made registration with facial technology mandatory for visitors with year-long passes. The new rules state that such behavior is now off-limits. The interpretation also rules against making facial recognition technology mandatory to enter residential compounds. It says alternatives must be provided.
I think the biggest highlight for the interpretation is the lines it draws about informed consent. It's put out specific scenarios that apply. This means the law is specific about protecting personal and consumer rights, and it could send out a message that the use of facial recognition technology will be strictly monitored.
The interpretation comes as the Personal Information Protection Law, which is expected to be even more comprehensive, is under development. And the Vice President of China's Supreme People's Court, Yang Wanming, recently promised that close attention is being paid to the safeguarding of people's rights and personal information. Sun Ye, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, now let's take a look at commodity markets today. Oil prices continuing to fall, hitting a two-week low. Traders say the spread of the coronavirus Delta variant in top consuming countries outweighed the impact of Middle East geopolitical tensions and, of course, a fall in U.S. inventories today. Meanwhile, gold prices edging higher, helped by a subdued dollar, but the precious metal did hover in a narrow range as investors wait for signals from U.S. jobs data on the labor market recovery. On that note, let's take a short break, still to come. A look at the eco-friendly startup shaking things up in Ghana's auto industry.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Admin Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg,
Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Kanata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival, and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Now, the car industry has largely been dominated by men, but now a Ghanaian startup specializing in building eco-friendly electric vehicles is intent on changing that. Solar Taxi has set up a training academy for female engineers in a bid to diversify the sector. Here's CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reporting from Accra.
Erica Amponsa and her team are charting a new path in the automobile industry in Ghana. They are part of an academy of female engineers set up by a startup, Solar Taxi, in Accra, learning how to build electric vehicles.
We assemble fully electric bikes, which are courier bikes. So at the assembling line, we have about 4 different sections. We have the chassis section, we have the electrical section, the accessory section, and then finally the cover installation.
In Ghana, men largely dominate the automobile industry. Solar Taxi wants to bridge the gap and has trained more than 50 women in the assembling of electric bikes since it began operating in 2019. And they want to find greener solutions in the automobile industry.
In Ghana, in Africa, you realize that pollution is big, most especially pollution in the transportation industry. So we sought out to solve the problem of pollution in the transportation industry.
But these female engineers still deal with breaking down stereotypes.
It's been quite challenging with people saying you can't do it, okay, do it and let's see. That kind of feeling.
Having worked on electric vehicles for nearly 2 years, Amponsa is also transferring her skills to other women. She wants more girls to take up engineering.
The encouragement should start from the home, where the girl child is being trained. So from the family, the parents and all that, they should be supportive when they feel or they see that their female child is having the desire to pursue engineering.
Ghana has yet to catch up with countries like Korea and China in the use of electric vehicles, but Solar Taxi is now introducing electric cars in the market. The cars are imported from China. This car can be driven for 300 kilometers when it is fully charged, and it takes about 6 hours to get it charged to full capacity. Erica Mponsa and her colleagues are now learning how to maintain electric cars as the vehicles are gradually being used in the country. Solar Taxi wants to set up its assembly plant next year, and this could be the opportunity for these female engineers to build Ghana's first electric cars. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
And before we leave you today, a quick look at Africa's currencies. As South Africa's rand hitting a new 3-week high today. Traders say it continues to draw benefits from a weaker dollar, even as numerous risks remain on the horizon. Meanwhile, Kenya's shilling dropping further against major international currencies as demand from importers heightened. Analysts say the high demand is from importers who fear stiffer COVID-19 restrictions by the Kenyan government as more severe variants hit the country. They also say the drop is seasonal and that the shilling is expected to stabilize in the coming days. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.